welcome. We're delighted to have you here. And my name is John Hamry. I am the president at CSIS, but this is an event that we are fortunate to be able to jointly sponsor with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And that really reflects Senator Nunn's remarkable stewardship after he left government. And he focused, he was the chairman of the board at CSIS for 19 years, but then he created NTI and turned it into a powerhouse, in the issues you're going to hear about today. So I just want to say welcome to everybody and a sincere thanks for you joining. I've been excited all weekend thinking about our event today because I was so privileged to have had I was in the back row, but I wasn't in the front row. But I had a back row seat to watch the making of history when Senator Nunn was the architect of it. And it was such a privilege to see all of that. We're going to learn more of that today by this conversation that Laura Holgate, Ambassador Holgate, is going to lead in conversation with Frank Jones, the author, and Sam Nunn. I mean, this is going to be an exciting morning. Laura, I should turn to you. Now, Laura Holgate has her own just remarkable history as an ambassador for the United States, and she was in the front lines of reducing the threat of nuclear weapons to all Americans. And so, Laura, congratulations to you for that. Now your role at NTI, and let's turn to you let's get this program really going. I'm so pleased to have a chance to be with you today.
Thank you so much, John. It's wonderful to be with you and for NTI to co-host this event with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And as you indicated, in some ways, this is a little bit of a reunion for me, having worked with you during my time at the Pentagon, as well as overlapping with our star author, Frank Jones, and of course, Senator Nunn, working for him indirectly or directly, both in his role as senator, overseeing the program that I was working with, and as well as the launching NTI and becoming my boss in that context. So I am really pleased to have a chance to lead these two distinguished gentlemen in conversation this morning. As I think we all know, former Senator Sam Nunn currently serves as the co-chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and as chairman emeritus of CSIS. He represented Georgia for 24 years in the US Senate, where he served for 8 years as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And we're here to discuss the book that chronicles those years by Frank Jones. He's written Sam Nunn, Statesman of the Nuclear Age, published by the University of Kansas Press. And Frank is a professor of security studies and the General George C. Marshall Chair of Military Studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. So gentlemen, welcome. And it's a real treat to be with you this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with a question to you, Frank. Any biography really does focus, on history through the lens and experience of an individual. And I'd like to hear from you what you felt was especially unique about Senator Nunn in his role as a leader in the Senate, and what you felt were the key aspects that contributed to the success and impact of his leadership during absolutely critical times in American history.
Okay. Well, thank you, Laura. Appreciate the question. First of all, let me thank CSIS and Nuclear Threat Initiative as well for sponsoring this event. I really appreciate that very much. I also want to say that the views I expressed today are certainly my own and don't necessarily reflect the policy or the procedures or the processes of the US government, the Defense Department, or the US Army. Senator Nunn's career interested me, I think, because of three elements. The first is when in America, the American public, journalists, scholars even, had paid a lot of attention to presidents and senior executives, if you will, of the executive branch in terms of US national security policy and strategy and US foreign policy. And over the years, I think we've neglected the role that senators and representatives in the House really play in that process. So I saw that first as it's a corrective. Secondly, as you mentioned, Senator Nunn had a illustrious career, 24 years in the Senate, 8 years, as you mentioned, as the chairman of the Senate Armed Service Committee, but also a subcommittee chairman and ranking member. And I think over that 24-year span, he had a outsized influence on a number of important issues: Soviet-US foreign relations, arms control, particularly nuclear arms control, conventional capability in NATO, and of course, he was a political risk taker in many cases. One can talk about his role in the Panama Canal treaties or the Persian Gulf War. So those are the areas that interest me. And lastly, I would say the importance of the committee chair, which has also been neglected for the most part by scholars. And that's a very important part, I think, as well, because I see the committees as kind of the engine rooms of our democracy. That's where in Congress, our nation's laws, our policies are really begun to be framed. And so looking his tenure as chairman and his other roles as well really speaks to, I think, those elements of what interested me as a political leader. And as I call in the book, it really is strategic leader.
Senator Nunn, hearing that and thinking about this phrase of the engine room of democracy, is that how you thought of the Senate Armed Services Committee as you served and led it?
Well, like Frank, I think the committees are greatly underestimated in terms of their importance. I think when committees are strong and thriving, we generally have the legislative process that works. When committees are not working together from the Republican and Democratic point of view, when they're divided on the subject matter, that's a problem. But we also are in an era where more and more of the authority and power is at the leadership level of the Congress rather than in the committees. Now, of course, we've had seniority challenges in the past. Perhaps people got beyond their prime when they were chairs of committees. You've had all of that. But by and large, the committees are where you have to educate the members in details that are enormously important. The committees are where the news media get the basis for their stories, whether they cover them directly or not. The committees are where you really get down to not just the Roman numerals and the titles, feel-good titles of legislation, but also the A's and B's and C's of how it really works and affects people, and how it affects, in the case of the Armed Services Committee, the U.S. military and the men and women who serve there. So I think one of the things that we could do when people ask me, how can we restore more effectiveness in the Congress, more cooperation, my answer would be start with the committees, because that's where you have to have cooperation. And usually you do have cooperation. Committee chairs and even ranking members, even though they're not in the majority and don't control the votes on the committee per se, can have an enormous influence. Most of my work on defense reorganization, where I felt I played a significant role, was when I was ranking member, not when I was chair. Goldwater was chair, but we worked together. And in that particular case, we appointed one person to be the staff person and to lead both staffs, a guy named Jim Locker, who did a great job. So my common denominator with Frank, and we probably have many, is that I see the way he sees the committee and the importance of the committee. And so I am grateful to him for covering that aspect of the congressional responsibility under the U.S. Constitution. And before I close the answer to this question, let me thank CSIS and NTI and Laura, you for sponsoring this program. And John Hamre, thanks to you, and to Ernie Moniz, who heads NTI now as a CEO. So thanks to all who made it possible.
Well, let's stick with that topic of cooperation, Senator Nunn. You are known for your bipartisan approach, your recognition of the need to have voices from both sides of the aisle, and humans, even more than voices, working together. That really comes through very strongly in Frank's book. Can you say a few words about your approach to bipartisanship and what you think might help us return to some of the effectiveness that created for you?
Well, of course, to have legislation that is successful and really addresses the critical issues that we face, you have to basically have a common set of facts. And then you can argue about solutions. You're always going to argue about solutions. But when you don't have a common set of facts, it's extremely difficult to come up with answers. And I think we've lost a lot of that over the years. You can debate forever about why, but I believe that committees can help establish the facts because you can call witnesses. And I always enjoyed having witnesses that had a different view, but they were on a panel and we tested one view against the other. And you had people sitting there on both sides of the aisle and they were listening to the same set of facts. And that begins to really pay off. Look at the American jury system. You get people from every walk of life, every economic group, every race, creed, and color. You put them in a box and they listen to the same set of facts with a judge who, let's call him the editor in terms of putting guardrails around the evidence, and they have a common set of facts and they determine matters of life and death and matters that survival of companies and individuals in terms of civil liability, matters of divorce and custody. They decide the crucial questions affecting us, and they're from every walk of life. The committees are not quite like that. That's not quite apples to apples, but in one way it is. Our judicial system works, and most people, hypothetically would say, how can that work? But it does. And so I think we really need to get back to this system that worked, I think, pretty darn well for a long time.
Frank, what's your take on the role of bipartisanship in the politics of the Senate at the time that Senator Nunn was there and what we've seen since then?
Well, I think that's really a tribute to Senator Nunn's own competencies. And those competencies are developed over time, obviously. I mean, he's elected in 1972. He represents a very different generational change in the Senate between former members of the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time. So I think it's a matter of him not only doing his homework, if you will, the technical competencies, the expert knowledge that he gains by being attentive to becoming an expert in defense and national security. I think it's also the conceptual aspects of this, understanding how the thinking skills, the vision that often earlier mentioned by Dr. Hamry was in reference to your background as well, Laura, the Nunn-Lugar legislation dealing with weapons of mass destruction, having that vision, thinking skills, if you will, high levels thinking skills. And I think there's, and you go back to the word cooperation, I think that's also part of it as well, the interpersonal skills that are necessary. I would say beyond cooperation, there's collaboration. There's that partnership, that's consensus building, and the ability to negotiate and the ability to communicate, and the idea of, I would say, of empathy. That's often forgotten, but the ability to see someone else's perspective and recognize that. And that does not mean that the political aspects do not come into play here, that there is not some transactional relationships here. But I think in the case of Senator Nunn, as I point out in the book, it's also transformational. How do you begin to change? How do you begin to change in a very dynamic security environment that changes absolutely dramatically between the 4 decades, if you will, of the Cold War, and then 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union? How do you make that change psychologically, cognitively? So I think those are part of the underlying aspects of his bipartisanship, in this willingness to work with Senators Cohen, certainly Senator Warner of Virginia, of the Republican side, and to build that consensus.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one thing that is really a theme that's woven throughout your book, Frank, is how the events of the world really framed Senator Nunn's vision as a thinker, as a political leader, as a moral voice in many of these topics. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think one of the best examples is the Nunn-Lugar legislation. This is legislation that he was able to forge, and I think it comes out of an experience, right? We are all kind of bound by our experiences. And it comes by an experience that he has in which he goes to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, and comes away with an impression about what's occurring. And what really fascinated me about the way he thought through the formulation of this legislation is how he began to perceive what he was experiencing. And he has the experience of going to the Soviet Union right after the August coup with Gorbachev. And he has an opportunity to see the change that's coming about in the state itself, and also the ability to interact personally with General Secretary Gorbachev, who he'd met before. And the unease that he felt, I think I can express it that way, as to who's controlling the nuclear weapons during a coup, or an attempted coup. And so when he comes back to the United States, my way I write it in the book is that he's thinking through this on 3 different levels. He's thinking about this bipolar world that's existed at the highest level, a system level, if you will, in which this bipolar world may be breaking down. Second of all, he's witnessed by his actual being on the ground in Moscow, the changes that are happening within the Soviet Union itself, the state level, if you will. And then his interaction with Gorbachev, which also gives him a feeling of what's happening with the individual. So he's looking at 3 dimensions there, and then bringing that back and being able to weave that with, again, bipartisanship, Senator Lugar, Republican in Indiana, but also bringing many others, Democrats and Republicans, together in order to build consensus and communicate an idea about how to deal with the accountability and the infrastructure of a Soviet Union that's beginning to unravel.
I think that's a really critical point, that and Senator Nunn, you and Senator Lugar, I think, were among the first to really see what a fundamental shift we were experiencing in the early 90s, and then to create, really a creative context to deal with it. I mean, if you think about what I say a lot is that, 2 years prior, Nunn-Lugar would have been crazy talk. But when you passed it, it was essential. It was critical to achieving US and, in fact, global goals to pilot our way through that incredibly dramatic shift in the global environment that I think not everybody realized was as dramatic as we now know it to be. Can you say a little bit more about that? And also want to invite you to say any words you'd wish to about our dear friend, Dick Lugar, who was your partner in that.
Well, Dick was a trusted partner. We saw things alike, but even when we didn't and had different opinions, we trusted each other totally. We weren't going to take cheap shots no matter what the situation was. And so that was a true partnership, and continued really after we formed NTI. He was on our board, and he and I worked together. He was the guy inside with all the power, and I was the guy outside with good folks like you, Laura, giving us great ideas. But backing up one step from where Frank, I think, articulated it so well, I had gone to NATO after the fall of Vietnam, and I spent a lot of time over there and wrote an actual report about the dangers coming out of the demoralization of the US military following Vietnam, the drug problems, the alcohol problems, so forth. The security of tactical nuclear weapons was one of the things I focused on, or the lack thereof. And so I had that background and understanding that what our military went through in Vietnam, the Soviet military went through in Afghanistan, probably times 2 or 3. And basically, so we had a breakup of the empire. The US fortunately didn't have that back then, but I sort of projected what if, and what if the same kind of demoralization was happening in the Soviet forces, and they had the largest arsenal of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and materials, as you know, Laura, you're the expert, but materials that can make weapons sometimes are more dangerous than weapons themselves because they're not as well protected. And in any event, all of that added up to the fact that when I came back from that trip that Frank mentioned, and I met with the military leaders over there, I met with the new folks who were Yeltsin crowd, I met with Gorbachev. I came back absolutely convinced. You know, sometimes you're 50% convinced, sometimes you're 60. I was 99.5% convinced, and therefore, you know, it was looked on as crazy legislation when it was first introduced. And basically, Les Aspin, and he played a huge role because on the House side, he was seeing this as I was. We actually had the Nunn-Lugar legislation, which wasn't called that at the time. At that time, it was Nunn-Aspin, I suppose, and it was in conference. We brought it out of conference, and the alarm bells went off both sides of the aisle, screaming and hollering. How can we possibly help our former enemies? And so basically, we had to pull the report down in September and start over again. And had I not been so convinced, had I not had these experiences, had I not internalized them, had I not seen the analogies and looked at the human nature aspect of all this material with people not knowing how to feed their families, I wouldn't have tried again so soon. But after going down in flames, so to speak, in September, we passed it in December. And that was a remarkable turnaround. And of course, Dick Lugar played a huge role in helping muster the support for that turnaround. So seeing facts on the ground and understanding facts gives you the confidence you need to really take on the critics and finally persuade them. We basically persuaded almost everybody that it was the thing to do in a 3-month period of time. And I must say that our friends at the Kennedy School, Ash Carter and Graham Allison, played a huge role in this because they had done analytical work. David Hamburg at Carnegie played a huge role in this because he had basically sponsored studies on this very subject. And our Russian friends, we have to always stop and say, hey, these folks, in spite of the fact they were enemies for a long number of years, they stepped up to the plate and they did the job cooperating with leaders like you, Laura, and Liz Sherwood Randall and others, and Bill Perry's excellent team. So the Russians, the people in Kazakhstan, the people in Ukraine, the people in Belarus, all of those folks over the next several years played a huge role in making this legislation a successful piece of legislation in preventing disasters. We don't know what was prevented. Thank God we will never know.
Yes. Well, that's just one huge and important piece of your longstanding concern about nuclear war. You were very active in the Senate's engagement with the arms control treaties that came forward during the Nixon and Carter administrations and those that came after. Can you say a little bit more about looking across your whole Senate career, looking at the risk of nuclear war and what your role could be as a senator?
Yes, well, I got acquainted with the nuclear challenge way back in '62. I was on the House Armed Services Committee staff person. My boss came in a week before the Air Force was taking a group of staff people from the Senate and House to Europe. And he asked me if I could take his place because he had some family problem. And I went, and it turned out to be right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I saw how close we came. I was being briefed by the Air Force and the top folks over there, and had just gotten my top secret clearance at 23 years of age. So at that stage, I decided if, we breathed a sigh of relief, but it seemed to me that we had to work these risks perpetually. As long as nuclear weapons exist, they're going to be these dangers. And of course, we still have them now, in some ways even more intense, some ways less. But nevertheless, the history of having dealt with this from a very young age taught me that perhaps one of the things that I should devote my interest to as much as possible was reducing that risk, because it is an existential risk for our citizens and for the Soviet Union citizens and for much of the world.
Frank, how did you see that? Yes, absolutely. Frank, how did you see that arc of the storyline as you were writing and preparing to write this volume? the senator's nuclear through line?
Yeah, I think an arc is an interesting way of characterizing it. It's also for me, it was a set of, if you will, milestones of the recognition that occurs as the dynamic changes between the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States in terms of its nuclear arsenal. And so I would also point out not only the Nunn-Lugar legislation that we talked about earlier, but Senator Nunn's work, particularly on risk reduction and the creation of centers in the United States and the Soviet Union to prevent a unintended or accidental launch of nuclear weapons, a very important aspect of it. And this continues to be an issue of concern. It should be. Second of all, the idea which you worked with Senator Cohen on, the idea of build down, to getting the size of these arsenals be smaller. And then I think really one of the more intriguing aspects of this is his work. Well, there are two others. One is the idea of reinterpreting the meaning of the anti-ballistic missile treaty that the Nixon administration put in place, in which the Senate gave it its advice and consent, but also the Reagan administration's reinterpretation of that in view of this strategic defense initiative, the old Star Wars concept. So this is I think is a very important point in his career about the prerogatives of the Senate. Once it gives its advice and consent, whether or not what members of the executive branch say in testimony remains to be the exact understanding, and not to go back and reinterpret it on the basis of some other aspect. I think this speaks also to the very nature of technological change. And that came in as well. I mean, Star Wars, the SDI, was a major aspect of technological challenge. And those type of challenges, technology challenges, still exist. And then I would say also, and this is something that intrigues me today, is this relationship between conventional capability and the threshold from conventional to nuclear. And Senator Nunn worked very diligently through the 70s and 80s to ensure that conventional deterrence of the Soviet Union was in place so that we would not resort, either side, but particularly NATO and NATO allies in the United States, would not resort to tactical or strategic nuclear weapons as a way to defend Western Europe. So that's a very important point as well. And as he mentioned, this earlier NATO studies that really were dedicated to that purpose.
Well, Frank, if I could ask you to fast forward a little bit to Senator Nunn's post-Senate career. As we've remarked in the preparation for this, Senator Nunn, you've been out of the Senate longer than you were in it, which is a little to imagine. I'll come to you in a minute, Senator. But Frank, tell me about your epilogue and kind of the frame you see in how some of these through lines have continued to be visible in Senator Nunn's post-Senate career.
Yes, I felt that there had to be an epilogue in the book, because just to end it in 1996, early 97 to be more exact, with his career was not really a complete picture. It was a complete picture of his tenure in the Senate, but as you just suggested, it didn't really speak to his ongoing interest in arms control issues and, as Dr. Hamry said at the beginning, the formation and the establishment of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And that carries over. And I think that's important because it's his work today, and it's been his work since 1997. And I thought also that he's recognized for that. Not only, I don't mean that he's not recognized by the Defense Department or others who've given him awards. I'm talking about others within the non-governmental organizations, et cetera, who also recognize the contributions in it. And many Americans, perhaps many people in the world, do not realize that he and Senator Lugar were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their work. So these are very important legacies of his career. And it's seen not only through the lens of arms control, but also the dedication he made to American security. And the fact that the vessel, the US Navy vessel, is being named for him, I think is also an indication of the regard in which he's held.
Well, those are critical points. And I think, Senator Nunn, I want to give you an opportunity to say a word or two about your post-Senate career. And, you know, obviously the two institutions represented here, CSIS and NTI, have been the, you know, the happy recipients of your attention and focus and intellect. But tell us, I'd like to hear about both your engaging with CSIS and then your take on the NTI founding phase. But then if you want to talk about other aspects of your post-Senate work as well, as it's been much more than that.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. CSIS, I worked with CSIS and was a beneficiary of David Abshire and the leadership they offered way back when I was in the Senate. And then I became chairman of the board, and the best move I made there was recruiting John Hamre, who's done a superb job at CSIS. But that kept me involved in the broad array of policy issues that I'd spent my whole Senate career on. And that kept me from going, quote, cold turkey, end quote, after I left the Senate. I stayed very involved in policy. And then NTI, with the tremendous support of Ted Turner and his vision and the great support of Warren Buffett, we've been going strong for about 20 years now and have made some significant, I think, strides from outside government as an NGO, helping government, cajoling government, urging government, pointing out where they can make improvements, showing the way, and putting some money on the table when we can fill a gap that governments can't tackle. And we've done that, Laura, with your tremendous leadership in the nuclear materials area, where we basically helped get a program called the Venture Program, getting about 4 bombs worth out of Serbia back when the tensions were very, very high there. Working with the State Department, they worked with the Russians and the Serbs. So that program, for instance, cost several $1 million. We put up $5 million as an NGO to help clean up the environment after the materials were taken away, because each one of those were a dream for terrorists in terms of the nuclear material. It was highly enriched uranium, and 4 bombs worth, not bombs, but bombs that were capable of being made from the material. Anyway, that program led to several $1 billion being spent in what I call for a while the global cleanout, getting highly enriched uranium, weapons usable material under control and blended down wherever possible around the world. And we've actually, and you played such a big role in this, gone from 40 countries that had nuclear material that could be made into weapons to about 22 countries now. So still a long way to go, but preventing catastrophic terrorism has been a big deal. So I was blessed to be able to continue a lot of the work that Dick Lugar and I did as a participant at NTI, and of course CSIS is one of the best think tanks in the world in terms of the broad array of issues, which is the background music for doing all these things. So I would say now a couple of things I think we really are trying to get done. One is a fail-safe review. I've talked to Dick Cheney and convinced him to, I believe, to do that kind of review. It became known as the Kirkpatrick Commission. And it was back when he was Secretary of Defense. It was turned over later to the next administration. A lot of significant changes in reducing nuclear risk. I won't go into the details, but it was done in the Pentagon with oversight by the Armed Services Committee, because I said to Dick Cheney at that time in a very friendly way that, you know, it would be better if the Department of Defense did it rather than Armed Services Committee. One way or the other, we were going to do it. And he took the bull by the horns, and they did a really good job. We need to do that again. We need to do it particularly in light of cyber, because cyber has changed the world, and it's made much more vulnerable command and control and warning systems, and made much more likely, much higher risk false warnings. That could happen in any country that has nuclear weapons, not just the United States. So what I'm urging now, and what we at NTI are urging, is a fail-safe review by the Biden administration with oversight by the respective committees, looking at everything that can go wrong to cause a blunder, and starting with the dangers of cyber. But artificial intelligence comes in here also. We're also urging the creation of a liaison committee in the Congress that would really cooperate much more between the Congress and the executive branch on nuclear weapons, on NATO, on arms control. And we basically believe that coordination at home is necessary to have the kind of strategic dialogue we need with the Russians and with the Chinese on a continuing basis to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons everywhere. So those are just two examples, but we've been able to do a lot more as an NGO than I would have thought, thanks to Ted Turner and Warren Buffett with funding and a lot of other good people. And thanks to people like Charlie Curtis and Ernie Moniz and Laura Yu and Corey Hinderstein. And of course, Joan Rothing was there right at the beginning. So we've had some really good experts involved in this. And I think that the nuclear question is one of existential importance. And, you know, government has to do the heavy lifting, but I think a lot of people outside government have to play a role here too, in this country and other countries. And once we do our fail-safe review, I think we should challenge, or even before, as we tackle it, we should challenge every other country that has nuclear weapons to do the same thing, because nuclear war by blunder, in my view, or nuclear use by blunder is much more likely than a deliberate, premeditated, out of the blue attack.
Well, and again, I think that's something that is not new to your thinking. It seems like that's been raised in likelihood compared with the kind of Cold War mutual assured destruction that was dominant. But even then, in the 60s and 70s, you were worried about the blunder challenge. Sticking with, you know, kind of where we are now, Senator, I'd love to ask you your sense of the future of arms control, having been, you know, a key player in so many of the history of our arms control legacy. Only one piece of it continues from the strategic nuclear context. How do you see U.S.-Russia arms control going forward? How do you place the engagement of China in a future arms control concept? Where do you see that heading right now?
Well, I don't think we're ready for a three-way negotiation between U.S., Russia, and China, but I do think U.S. should have intensive, strategic, continuing dialogue with the Russians, even when we disagree with them fundamentally on a lot of things, which we do. And I think we should begin that kind of dialogue with China. In my view, you're not going to see nearly as many treaties in the next 30 years as you saw in the past in arms control. For one thing, the technology is changing so quickly. It's very hard to anticipate that in treaties, but we're going to have a whole lot more dialogue, not just at the presidential level. And I applaud the summit conference that President Biden is now going to have with President Putin. And certainly I applaud the continuation of the START treaty, which was one of the first moves the Biden administration made. But we're going to have agreements that are responsive, and they themselves are going to have to be changed as we go along. But understandings, for instance, right now, we need the understandings, red lines on not using cyber to attack warning systems of any country with nuclear weapons, and not attacking command and control, because you may just be probing, but you may end up being tripping a wire that makes another country think they're under attack. So we could have false warning, and that is enormously destabilizing. So there are all sorts of things we need to do, and treaties are so difficult. And I think the Senate itself has done some damage to its own treaty making authority and advice and consent by making it so difficult for the executive branch and tying so many things to the treaties and requiring, in the case of arms control, so much expenditure in order to get the votes to pass a treaty, that I think if any president comes scratch his head and say, shouldn't we just have an executive agreement? And of course, I think that weakens the Senate itself and weakens the process, but I think that's where we are right now. But we've got to have understandings in other countries. And one of the things I think is so important is for young people to start using the information age and universities to start using the information age to have dialogue with each other so that we begin to get a common set of facts, not just in this country, but between the United States, young people, professors, academics, as well as Russian, as well as down the road Chinese, because they are inheriting the nuclear power, which is enough to blow up the world. And I think people have to understand that. That's where we are. And so we're going to have to find ways, in my view, to rethink mutual assured destruction. We've got to find a way to have mutual assured survival. That's going to take a lot of steps, going to take a lot of dialogue, and it's going to take a lot of leadership. But starting with young people knowing each other, even if it's virtual, is enormously important. So those are things that we're working on, rethinking deterrence, keeping in mind that the vision of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to have a world without nuclear weapons is what holds the countries together, in the sense that countries that did not develop nuclear weapons have pledged not to develop them, in exchange for those countries that have nuclear weapons pledging to step by step get rid of them. So that's the deal. And if that deal comes apart, you're not going to just have 9 countries with nuclear weapons, you're going to have far more. So that's the stakes that we're working on every day, both inside and outside government.
Well, it's been an honor to work on those with you, and I want to thank you for assembling such a stellar team at NTI to work with. Those people you mentioned earlier have been such wonderful colleagues and friends before and since NTI's founding. I want to come back to you, Frank, and look at this issue of the famous 4 horsemen column between Senator Nunn, the recent passing of George Shultz, which made us all very, very sad to lose that statesman, along with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry and former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. This grand bargain that Senator Nunn just referenced was at the heart of their famous editorial, joint editorial in 2007. Can you say more about how you felt that was received and what impact that had on the nuclear conversation at that point?
Yes, I think that one could actually argue that raised a lot of attention to the issue, that the perception of, if you will, 4 Cold Warriors getting together and coming together in a way where they saw the future in a very similar way in terms of what Senator Nunn just spoke to, the idea of the threat of nuclear weapon, the existential threat that exists, and how important that is. I think also when one looks at the history of arms control in the United States, and I'm not just within the context of Senator Nunn, but going back to the 1960s, one has to recognize that arms control treaties, it seems to me, are imperfect vehicles. They are not guarantees, and they need to be worked at, as Senator Nunn was suggesting, I believe. They need to be worked at and constantly cultivated and like a garden. And they're not perfect in that respect. I also think that one of the issues that you raised by actually mentioning these Wall Street Journal op-eds is the question of public opinion. And that had a big impact in the 1980s. Perhaps it's because there was a recognition by the American public, the European public as well, but also media and also the films that were coming out during that period about the destructive nature of nuclear weapons and the consequences. So I think that's an element as well, is the public education aspect. And then I think there is, as Senator Nunn was alluding to, I think there's that need for, whether it's something like the former Senate Arms Control Observer Group or something like that, to begin that dialogue between the executive and the legislative branches. I still think that's underdeveloped today. And I also have to think that we have to understand that treaties, arms control treaties, are not just diplomatic instruments. they're tied to the military strategy. And so understanding that context is very important as well. And that's why there are members of the Secretary of Defense's office and the Joint Staff, the military staff, on the negotiating teams to understand threats, consequences, and verification issues which come through the intelligence community. So all of this is bound up, and it's really important to see this many different dimensions of arms control. So I think those are points that I would make about public education, public understanding, public awareness, even the role of both the Senate and the Congress in general, the executive branch, NGOs such as NTI, and bringing that all together is really what arms control requires, and it does require that dialogue and that investment over time, because it is not something you just can leave and say, well, we have this ratified treaty, it's got the advice and consent of Congress, we got this, excuse me, of the Senate, we got it in 1992 or whenever, and we just can let that stay, and that's it. That's the end of it. We can wash our hands. So I see arms control as a continuing process.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you say, changing over time. And, you know, to Senator Nunn's point about the difficulty of getting anything that the Senate could accept, does lead us to think about new modes of cooperation. And I think about the presidential nuclear initiatives from the early days of the Bush administration, where you had both US and Russia making statements about how they were going to take action, not in a treaty context, and, you know, very quickly, in fact, in response to changes that were happening in both countries. And to me, one of the interesting points that leads to, in some cases, the role of the public and or the non-government community is the heightened ability of non-government people to actually see what's happening because of technology. We can have, and we're seeing it in the Middle East in some cases already with groups like Bellingcat, we can almost have some form of public verification of commitments. And so maybe that can take out some of that challenge of getting things through the Senate that are treaties, if we can make agreements that we can each see without necessarily having to have that whole architecture, superstructure of agreed and legally binding verification.
Yes, but that's the issue of, speaking for a minute, Laura, just to interject, that's also the issue of that the Senate had a reputation even earlier as the graveyard of treaties. And so it's important to put this in perspective and not look at this entirely through our current present viewpoint of how the Senate works or doesn't work.
Yeah. Senator Nunn, did you have any thoughts on that point?
No, I think Frank is right. And this liaison group that we're talking about would be like the Arms Control Observer Group, and they would be following these issues. And the reason that worked so well, it was leadership appointed, it included committee chairs, and therefore the people who really were responsible for treaties. In this case, it was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which has just been canceled, and which we're going to have to find a way to keep medium-range missiles from being redeployed in Europe. Problem hasn't gone away. Treaty's gone away. Agreement's gone away. Problem still exists, because if you put those missiles in Europe, both Russian missiles as well as US missiles and NATO missiles, then you reduce decision time because you're so close to the targets in the case of Moscow as well as the European capital. So going back to deploying those weapons would be, in my view, extremely unwise and very risky venture. So something has got to take the place of that. Frank mentioned conventional forces. The reason countries have nuclear weapons many times is because of conventional weaknesses. So I did spend a whole lot of my career trying to build up Americans' conventional forces so we didn't have to have the terrible decision of using nuclear weapons on day one of any kind of war. And that is, to some extent, still exists, not so much as America and NATO these days, but you know, that's one of the reasons the Russians rely on conventional forces, on nuclear forces now. It's what's going on with India and Pakistan, an extremely dangerous situation where they are going to tactical short-range battlefield nuclear weapons. And guess what, Laura, as you well know, if you have an outbreak of a conventional war and those weapons are up front because they're short range, then you either got to use them or lose them pretty quickly. And so that's very destabilizing. So, you know, we're not finished with history. A lot of history, like the INF Treaty, the Conventional Forces Treaty, they all needed updating, Open Skies Treaty, but the problems still exist and we no longer have any rules of the road in those areas. So perhaps the renewal of START will get us back to the table so we both understand we're not doing each other a favor. You know, having agreements on nuclear weapons is not a reward for good behavior to Russia or vice versa. It's an absolutely essential kind of step to protect our own security, protect the European security, and it also, of course, applies in Asia.
Well, Frank, that was something that you said you wished you'd had a chance to talk to Senator Nunn a little bit more about during the interviews that you did with him, is about that threshold between conventional and nuclear weapons. And so you're talking about moving from, you know, kind of a pre-conflict balance that Senator Nunn is talking about, where the conventional power gives you confidence to depend heavily on your nuclear power. But if you're actually in the conflict and looking at that moment where you might be moving from a conventional to nuclear, are there aspects of that you'd like to hear more from Senator Nunn about?
Well, I'm certainly interested in his views, and he alluded to it earlier, and that's the issue of the cyber, how cyber has actually changed our understanding of thresholds. I mean, is this an outdated concept, this idea of a threshold? How should we look at a threshold? Is it something you cross over? Or do we see it as something you escalate up? And so if you have a technology, as he said, that can create havoc by false alarms or other triggering events, then where do we go with here? How do we think about this idea of thresholds where you can no longer just rely on conventional capability to a large degree? That, I think, it calls into question about what we mean by cybersecurity, what we mean by cyber deterrence, and the relationship, as he pointed out earlier, with command and control structures. So I think it's a one that needs to be, I know it is being explored, but I think it's one that really we should pay more attention to.
Senator Nunn, do you have thoughts about that, what cyber means for that threshold? We've talked a lot about what it means for, you know, the blunder or the mistake or, you know, the command and control issues. But if you're in the middle of a hot war, how does cyber affect that shift from conventional to nuclear?
Well, it complicates everything. It makes decision making much more difficult. It makes decision time much more compressed. And it gives third parties and third countries and even, you know, non-state actors a role in the game. We're not the only ones. It's not a U.S., Russia, China, you know, P5 monopoly on nuclear weapons and technology these days. We got 9 countries with nuclear weapons, and you've got, you know, thousands and thousands of people who can play with cyber out there that can basically cause mistakes and basically put up spoof attacks that aren't real, but are perceived to be real for crucial moments. So I would say that if considering all of that and considering the awesome responsibility of President of the United States and the President of Russia, as well as the President of other nuclear weapon states, the thing that I would put on the top of the list, if I had my way, if it won't happen at this summit, but I would love to see President Biden and President Putin say to their military commanders jointly, we want more decision time. We don't like having 5, 6, 7 minutes. If you come in and tell us we may be under attack, either we fire now or we lose our weapons or even our cities. Give us more decision time. Get the best scientists, get the best military people, get the best thinkers. If we've got 7 minutes now, hypothetically, give us 15. If we've got 15, give us 30. And when we get to 30 minutes, give us an hour. So we do not have to make that crucial decision. We have to do it with conventional force postures. There are a lot of complications. It's not an easy drill, but this is one of the most important things that the two leaders could do. And if you could get to a day or a week before you had to make a decision, it would make the chances of nuclear blunder far, far less, a nuclear war far, far less. And guess what? It could also lead to rather dramatic reductions because nuclear weapons would become less relevant. But I think these are the kind of steps that could be taken by leaders with real vision. And I'm hoping that at some point that's going to happen.
Well, vision is certainly something that we've been in short supply of for decades now, and we're in great need of it. So I share your hope and hopefulness for, if not this meeting, then future meetings between U.S. and Russian presidents. Frank, in doing the research for this, you spoke a lot to Senator Nunn, but you spoke to a lot of other people too. There's been any number of staff who have themselves risen to high positions. I think that speaks to the nose for talent that Senator Nunn has had both at the Senate and subsequently. Who was the interview, apart from Senator Nunn, who was it that you got the most out of in writing the book among those who you talked to?
Well, you're always benefiting from someone who actually sits down and writes a book for you, like Arnold Pernaro and Roland McElroy, who provide you a great deal of information. So that was certainly very helpful to me, understanding and getting different perspectives of staff who have been there and written about it and written extensively. Then Bob Bell, Jim Locker, I would say were very helpful. Jim started me on this process in a way by talking to me about the role of the chairman of the Senate Armed Service Committee. And also Dick Combs was also very instrumental, particularly when I got to the INF treaty. So those gentlemen, and then I have to admit that Kathy Glynn, I'd have to say right up front, is made all of this possible. She was, if you will, she was like the conductor of the orchestra. She made sure all the brass and the woodwinds and the violins that were all playing in sync for me. And Senator Nunn was so gracious in spending his time with me and answering questions. And so that was very valuable. And I would say the reviewers at the press, Douglas Harris, was particularly very helpful to me in my thinking about this. So yes, those are the few that I mentioned.
Well, it was my honor to play a tiny role in the orchestra, and always to be conducted by Kathy. That has been a joy of my life now for several years, and something, someone that Senator Nunn has been conducted by in a way for decades now. So Senator Nunn, we've got 1 minute. Do you have a final benediction for us?
Well, I had good people working for me all along, and not only my staff, but also the key people on the Goldwater staff, key people on the Cohen staff, key people on the Warner staff. All of those people played a huge role. And my wife was the most popular spouse of anybody in the Senate, I'm convinced, in the diplomatic corps. She knew people from all over the world, even had the NATO ambassadors come down to Georgia as a unit. Most time I think they'd ever spent together socially. So to Colleen, she made an awful lot of this possible, perhaps all of it. But anyway, thanks to a lot of people. And Frank, you did a great job on the book. You know more about my career by far than I remember now. So I may have to call you and ask you what the heck I did certain times in my life.
Well, thank you, appreciate that.
He's done us all a favor by putting it out there, getting it on paper, but also publishing it and getting it out into the world, and so many lessons to be learned there. And I know I'll continue to do so as well. So let me close by thanking our two guests, Senator Sam Nunn, author Frank Jones, for Dr. Hamry and his team at CSIS for pulling us together this morning, and the indomitable Kathy Gwynn for pulling it all together. Thanks again for listening, and hopefully there'll be more to come. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.